Hey everybody, thanks for joining me today, Ross Marcagiani, with another great conversation at revowell.com. Today we're going to be talking about SIBO. Talking about how we get SIBO, what it is, some common signs and symptoms, how we test for it, and then how we diminish or get rid of SIBO. I hope you're ready. Let's dive in. So what does SIBO stand for? SIBO stands for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And before we talk about what exactly is going on, we need to talk about a little bit of anatomy. So in our GI tract, we have the small intestine. The small intestine is super important for digesting all of our nutrients, or the majority of our nutrients, specifically our fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, E, and K, and our water-soluble vitamins, such as various B vitamins, vitamin C, and other really important nutrients for our body. And then we have the large intestine. Large intestine is really important for absorbing water and ions and minerals. And in between, we have a barrier that walls off and separates the two. And that's called the ileocecal valve. So remember that. It's really important as we get into this conversation. In between the small intestine and large intestine is the ileocecal valve. And what's going on in SIBO is basically we have our large intestine, which has a ton more. To be specific, it's got 1 billion bacteria per milliliter, whereas the small intestine has 10,000 bacteria per milliliter. So we have this bacteria from the large intestine that starts to migrate up towards the small intestine, and there it starts to sit and creates this dysbiosis, which we'll talk about, which basically just means that it's going to create more bad bacteria because its gut bacteria isn't meant to be in the small intestine. It's supposed to be in the large intestine. And it migrates up, sits in the small intestine, and we create dysbiosis, which is going to be more bad bacteria than good bacteria. What we want to try to strive for is eubiosis, is where we have the opposite. We have more good bacteria and less bad bacteria. We have a healthy microbiome. And how does this happen? How does this bacteria get up there? Well, when we're talking again about that ileocecal valve, the ileocecal valve can be influenced by how much how much the food's broken down. It can be influenced by vagal tone, and it can be influenced by our pH balance. So if any of these factors are off, it's going to cause the ileocecal valve to not close properly. And if it's open, we're going to have that bacteria from the large intestine migrate up towards the small intestine and creating SIBO. Other ways we have this complex called the migratory motor complex. And I like to think it as someone is going along and sweeping the contents of our bowel down towards the rectum. So the things we don't need, we have this complex during our fasting state when we're not eating, someone coming by and sweeping the content down to the rectum. And this can be disrupted. So if we have constant constipation, this is going to negate our migratory motor complex. If we have, again, incorrect balance for our pH, this will negatively influence the MMC. Also, if we are grazing too often, so if we're constantly eating something, it's not going to allow the MMC to kick in because it's, again, happening during fasting. So this is another way, and that bacteria just sits there instead of moving along, and now it has nowhere to go but up. So and also before I jump into signs and symptoms, other ways that we can contribute to SIBO is if we're taking excessive antibiotics, if we have excessive yeast overgrowth, if there's a parasite in the GI tract, if we are taking, or if the gallbladder's not working correctly, we're not producing bile or secreting bile to break down lipids and fats. If the pancreas isn't secreting the correct amount of enzymes, we're not going to be able to break down our food. If we have excessive intake of starch, sugars, specifically fructose, that will sit in the GI tract and cause fermentation. Also, if we are taking antacids or PPIs or other factors are going to influence our pH. And like I was talking about briefly, is that we have this bacteria now sitting in the small intestine. And now the small intestine isn't going to be able to absorb correctly, and it starts to ferment the food that's in there. So think of it as like creating kombucha or making your own beer, where it literally, that food, specifically the carbohydrates, are starting to ferment and they are putrefying in our digestive tract because they're not being absorbed correctly and they're not moving down the GI tract. So our signs and symptoms. So typically we're going to have nausea, we'll have flatulence, diarrhea, we'll have constipation, malnutrition, irritable bowel syndrome, leaky gut syndrome, chronic fatigue syndrome, we'll have rosacea, GERD, acid reflux. These are all signs and symptoms that can contribute to SIBO. And a cool fact that I found is that the World Journal of Gastroenterology came out and found a direct correlation that SIBO directly causes IBS, which I thought was pretty cool to know. And then, so how do we test for this? Well, we'll do a stool antigen test because we want to look and make sure if there's any parasites or if any we have excessive yeast overgrowth in the stool, or if we have a dysbiosis or a large accumulation of bad bacteria in the stool. That will give us an indication on what's going on. If we have excess hydrogen and methane, so we can test for that. Remember, I talked about the small intestine not being able to absorb correctly. So a lot of those carbohydrates will sit in the small intestine and ferment. And as they ferment, they start to produce methane and hydrogen. So we can measure that level and see if that level is excessively elevated. We can also do the lactulose breath test, which is very similar to measured hydrogen and methane. Lactulose is just going to be a byproduct of carbohydrates when they start to ferment. So again, we get a clearer picture of what's going on. And then how do we remove this small bacterial overgrowth? Well, like with anything, we're going to start with nutrition because nutrition is priority number one. And typically what we want to do is we want to eliminate more of those complex or longer chain carbohydrates, such as our disaccharides and our oligosaccharides. And we want to limit mainly to monosaccharides, which are easier to break down and don't require a lot of energy. And we'll typically have diets. The diets that will mainly focus on that are going to be like our SCD, which is our specific carbohydrate diet. And then just a more detailed, which is correlated to it, would be our GAPS diet. And then we also have a FODMAP diet. So again, all these diets focus on carbohydrate restriction or limiting to specific carbohydrates such as our monosaccharides. Then we'll increase digestive enzymes because we're unable to digest and absorb these nutrients because of this bacterial overgrowth. We're just going to make it a little bit easier for the body so it doesn't have to put as much work to digesting these nutrients. So we'll increase the body with some HCl, so we're making sure we have a balanced pH. Making sure we're going to give the body pancreatic enzymes, so it's going to cause the release of the enzymatic response in the pancreas to break down food easier. We're going to increase motility with magnesium glycinate. This will help if we have constipation to start moving the contents in the GI down to the rectum. And we're going to increase with elimination. So this would be typically with like a bentonite clay, activated charcoal, something that's going to, other soluble fibers that's going to start binding and collecting the bad bacteria, basically putting a straitjacket around the bad bacteria and help escorting it out of our system. And then we're going to make sure we take botanicals here. So these are going to be what's going to fight the bad bacteria. It's going to start to destroy and diminish our bad bacteria. Botanicals such as oregano oil, grapefruit seed extract, artemisia, berberine. These are all really good botanicals to start to knock down the bad bacteria. And then we're going to take probiotics. So these are going to now re-inoculate and create good bacteria, such as our Saccharomyces boulardii, our Lactobacillus acidophilus, our Lactobacillus plantarum. These are all healthy probiotics that are going to build up the GI tract with good, healthy bacteria, creating eubiosis. We're also going to add in, which I don't have in here, are nutrients that's going to help destroy the biofilms. And this is where people struggle. Biofilms are basically the bacteria's defense mechanism. They create these films that help protect them from sources that are going to destroy them. So we have certain supplements and we have certain nutrients that will destroy biofilms. And that's basically it. I hope you enjoyed this video. Like I always say, we're in this together to become healthier and happier. I really appreciate your time. Thanks and have a great day.